On to another issue which can at times inflame people's passions, if I can put it that way. If you send your child to a state school, they will have some religious education, but it's not often education about all religions. Rather, it's mostly religious instruction only about Christianity, provided by outsiders to the school, not by teachers. In many cases, it's provided by a group, Access Ministries. There is one group of parents in the state who say it simply shouldn't be happening. Scott Hedges is a member of the group Fairness in Religion in Schools, and he's written a number of opinion pieces which have been published both online and in newspapers as well. He's with us this morning. Scott, good morning to you and welcome.
Oh, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Why did you join this group? Why are you sort of campaigning about this?
Well, I suppose it's because what happened to our children in primary school around this issue.
What happened? Explain what happened.
Well, along with other parents in the school, we sort of assumed that any teaching would about religion would be educational in nature and not really part of a Christian ministry being run by a group which had evangelical intentions. In other words, we didn't realize our kids were going to be preached to sort of outside of the context of church, or our church that we might want to go. So we sort of realized this was going on after it happened.
Okay, so what did you expect religious education was? Did you think it would be more comparative religion?
Yeah, I mean, I think along with most of the parents at the school think that, religion is part of the world in which children live. So learning about festivals and traditions and different customs, these often have a religious dimension. So they should be taught. Children should learn them. But what's happening in the schools is actually a Christian mission being run by a group of Christian missionaries that are using the schools as a venue for what they call a mission field.
Right, okay. Well, what does that mean? That is what, just somewhere that they can operate to try and recruit new members to their religion?
Yeah, that's a fair way to put it.
Okay.
When accused of that, though, they have a whole other set of things that they can say, but
How long has there been religious education in state schools, Scott? It's been a while now, hasn't it?
Well, it's an interesting story. The Victoria had a problem how to create a system of education, and there was a number of efforts to do this. But the first public education system in Australia was created in Victoria in 1872, and it was created under a principle of secular instruction. Now, before this, there had been attempts to do sort of let churches run education, which had been, by the way education had always been done.
Right, okay.
I mean, up until a certain point in time, the idea that, you had to send your kid to school, the idea of, in other words, compulsory education, and the idea that there would be some place run by the government, provided as part of, citizenship. These were new ideas, and it just so happened that they coincided in time with the founding of the Australian colonies. So the colonists here implemented these ideas, and what I learned in studying this was that Victoria was the first colony, was the first real governmental entity that ever said, look, we're going to have a compulsory system of education founded on the secular principle.
So we were ahead of the game here.
Well, you were not only ahead of the game, you were the first place. This colony was the first place in the world that it had ever been done in law. The school systems in America, some of them started in the 1600s, and they were run by, under a religious structure. And the colonies were often set up, the colonists were seeking religious freedom from the hierarchy in England, but they sure as hell wanted to set up their own religious hierarchy and oppress, minorities in their own. So what happened here was totally different. It was a system where the government said, look, we see that this is going to cause problems if each church has its own set of schools. And in many cases, these were extremely rural, extremely poor areas. So Australia leaped ahead of England in its literacy rates after this happened. And poor children, for the first time, were given access to good education. It was one of the sort of greatest engines of advancement ever created in this country.
Yeah. As far as the religious education, it's been there from that start, I assume, in the secular education, or did it come back in after a while?
Well, yeah, so it did come back in after a while,
okay.
But it's important for people to understand that the birth of public education was actually a controversy between the
church schools and
the church. In other words, the church said, we don't want you. We want to have our church schools. In other words, we insist that children be given an education based in the scriptures. And the government said, look, guys, this isn't going to work. And they created, and that's why you drive around Melbourne and all throughout Victoria, you see these buildings, they're beautiful, and they say state school number, big numbers.
Yeah.
That was a message. That was a message that these were secular institutions. We weren't going to pay attention to whether you were Catholic or Protestant. And, of course, the clergy howled. I mean, they were writing letters back to Ireland, send nuns. And they were pouring in here, like everybody else, the gold rush. And, this was a time of great social, explosion. But the point was the churches had always been attacking this idea that you could run an education system without instructing children in belief, in other words, in shaping their religious identities. And so the government, the colonists, who were very progressive and quite disinterested in the obvious tensions that were on display in Ireland and England, they said, we're going to leave religion aside. It's something you should do with your church. And they were deliberate. They said, the Catholics have churches, Presbyterians have churches, and the Anglicans have churches, and you're all sort of equals. Now, it wasn't until 1950 that the current system was implemented, and it was implemented as a Cold War project. It was implemented really as out of anxiety over
communism, godless communism, and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and all sorts of other changes. After the war, women had been, gone into the workforce and were doing men's work. I mean, there's all sorts of things going on at that time. But yeah, it was a time of great anxiety, and it in the United States, for instance, they put the word "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance at that same time, and this was to indicate how capitalism differed from communism by being sort of godly ordained. Anyway, yeah.
Scott, can I ask, do you accept that much of our society is based on a lot of those Christian values that have developed over time? A lot of our folklore and our mythology is based in that sort of thing, and to some extent, children will learn this stuff anyway, and that learning where it comes from in the Bible and all that is perhaps one way they can learn. They don't have to necessarily take it as truth, but parents can explain it's mythology if that's what they believe it is. That to just learn that cultural literacy.
Look, absolutely. That's why these what you just said should be taught by teachers in an educational way. For instance, but I want to say something specifically about that, because this is the kind of thing that is heard over and over again, and it's simply a distortion of the truth. The truth is that the Western civilization and what came to be the United Kingdom and what came to be democracy in our tradition, so to speak, draws heavily on the classic tradition. If you go, the first important and still probably the most important public monument ever built was the Shrine of Remembrance. I mean, this was a massive undertaking for the people of Victoria in response to a great tragedy. It is not a Christian building, right? It is a classical building. It's a copy of one of the seven wonders of antiquity. It doesn't have any Christian or biblical motifs, themes, concepts. So what we're hearing today is actually the notion that all of our, civilization is based on the Bible is really problematic if you actually understand history, which is not to say that England wasn't a Christian nation. It's just to say that being a Christian nation doesn't equal being a democratic liberal society. There are plenty of Christian nations which are, have never accomplished anything like what Australia has accomplished. And you have to ask yourself, well, what's the difference? It's not the Bible that gets you the Magna Carta, for instance. It just isn't. The Magna Carta, which is sort of one of the seminal documents in English common law, is an argument between two groups of Christians. And the Pope was not at all pleased that the king signed it. In other words, he wrote the king and said, you can't do that. And democracy is an argument between who is sovereign, where do the king's powers come from? Do they come from God, or do they come from the consent of the governed? Now, you can pull all that out of the Bible, just like you can pull, you can pull an argument for slavery, which was made by Christians, and you can pull an argument against slavery, which was made by Christians. So it's very problematic if you really want to teach people about what our civilization is, to just say, well, we have to have the Bible, because it's really not the whole story.
Scott, if we can come back to more practical matters with this, with your children in school, did you ask to take them out of the religious education, or did you leave them in?
Well, that's a good question. At first, I just said, well, this is fine, this is the way it is, And I was talking to a friend of mine at the school who was Jewish, and it came up, and I was sort of annoyed because I could see what was going on. And I thought, oh, this is really just sneaky, and it was, it was annoying, but I didn't pull my kids out, because your choice is, you want to pull your kid out and tell them, oh, you don't belong in the group. But my friend was Jewish, and of course, they have a set of distinct traditions. And she was quite put out by this, and she explained to me why, and I said to her, look, why don't you go say something? And she said to me, I can't. And I said, well, why can't you? And she said, well, you don't understand what it's like. There's only one of me. And that's when I said, well, I'll pull my kids out. They'll sit in the hall with the Jewish kids. Other parents did the same thing. And, we started to make our argument that this whole system was bankrupt.
Scott, it's been lovely to talk to you and hear some of your thinking on this and your arguments. Thanks for your time.
Oh, thanks for asking.
Scott Hedges, member of the group Fairness in Religion in Schools, and you can decide for yourself. You can look at their website. If you just put in Fairness in Religion in Schools, you'll see some of their arguments. They would like to see an end to the religious education as it currently stands in schools being religious instruction, is their argument, rather than comparative religion.